do that for right now. We can actually just go ahead and get started with some introductions, and I might leave the screen sharing off for right now, just so we can all see each other. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is the last day of January. It's crazy to think that February starts tomorrow. But this is our third subcommittee meeting for the Environmental Justice Action Task Force. And this subcommittee, which you all have selected, is going to be focused on our equity analysis. And so as we get started, I thought it could be good for us to just do a refresher on introductions. So if you could just share your name, your pronouns if you would like, and your affiliation. And then the little icebreaker question that I would like to ask you all is something that makes you feel excited to be alive right now. So your name, your pronouns, what your affiliation is, like which group you're coming to the table. And the icebreaker question is, what is something that makes you feel excited to be alive right now? Okay, so with that, I can go ahead and get us started. So as all of you likely know, at least our task force members, I see we do have a few members of the public on the call as well. Welcome everybody. And just as a quick reminder, we're going to have the task force members introduce themselves verbally. So you can come off mute and we can maybe just do a popcorn style. So I can pass it to the next person, and then whoever introduces themselves next, please do select somebody to speak. So we'll have the EJ unit, our attorney, Emily, and the task force members introduce themselves. For members of the public, if you would like to introduce yourselves in the chat, and you can feel free to answer the icebreaker question in the chat as well. So my name is Lubna Ahmed. My pronouns are she, hers, Aya, and I am the Environmental Justice Boards Manager. And something that makes me excited to be alive right now is that the Cincinnati Bengals are going to be participating in the Super Bowl, which I, as somebody who was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, have been a Bengals fan since I was a child, and not something that we envisioned happening, but was an incredible game yesterday. We were the underdogs and continue to be the underdogs going into the Super Bowl, and so I'm very, very excited about that. Yeah, so that's my piece. And I will pass it on to Mira.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mira, she, her, hers. I'm a senior climate policy analyst at Western Resource Advocates, also a member of the task force. And one thing that makes me excited to be alive right now, obviously it's been a very difficult month in Colorado, but seeing some of the relief efforts spring up in communities around the Superior and Louisville areas, and seeing all the work go on there gives me encouragement for the future. And I will pass it to Beatriz.
Hola, buenas tardes. Beatriz Soto. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I am a member of a disproportionately impacted community in CD3. And something that keeps me very excited is I've been reflecting a lot on being a good ancestor, and that really being, what guides how I live and how I raise my family. So anyway, I'm excited to be a good ancestor. I'm going to pass it on to Arthur.
Thank you. Arthur Ortegon, I use he and him. Something that gives me life these days are my children. I have a 4- and a 1.5-year-old. We recently lost my father about 2.5, 3 weeks ago. So leaning into how incredible those small humans are as life-giving, I guess a good term for it. I feel like I just forgot to look. So what was that, Luna? The last thing.
Just your affiliation, where you're coming from.
Oh, person of color. Thank you. That's what it was. I represent. My parents are immigrants, and so I am South American Colombian. And so with that, I'll toss it over to Tyson.
Tyson Johnston, he, him pronoun. I'd have to piggyback off of Arthur and go with my children. Despite the intense environmental impact that I realize my children have, I have 4 children, ages 13, 10, 4, and 2. But I wouldn't give them up for the world. They're the most amazing kids ever. And I think that with the right guidance, they can be the future to help us through these issues. So I can't wait to see what they do, both academically, athletically, and anything else they choose to do with their lives. But they are my heart, soul, and everything. So they are the ones that keep me going every day, not to mention my wife, who keeps us all in line. She says she has 5 children. I say I have 4. I guess the discrepancy is me. So, and I will pass it on. Who has not gone yet? Kimberly.
Thanks, Tyson. Yes, Kimberly Mendoza Cook, she, her, and I represent disproportionately impacted communities from CD7. I'll piggyback on the children. I have a 11-year-old son, and really right now he's preparing for middle school next year, and so they're starting those conversations with the 5th graders now, and just watching sort of what all of those kids are doing and the conversations the kids are having as they kind of take their next step into their progression in school, given, you know, some of them have been remote and some of them have been in person through the last 2 years. Just watching him, but all of the kids that that I've had the opportunity to work with over the past 2 years in that class, and their transition has been really, really great for me. So, and I will, let's see, Trisha.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Trisha Oath. I work at She, Hers. I work at Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and I'm filling the seat for a representative with expertise in water quality from our department. Something that makes me excited to be alive right now are that the Olympics are about to start. I always look forward to the Olympics. I'm always super impressed by the talent of all of the athletes, but also really get kind of teary and into the whole international, a place where we can all put aside differences, politics, differences, religion, and just really kind of come together and, appreciate humanity. So that makes me happy to be alive. I will pass it on to Marsha.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to stay off for a while because I'm eating my lunch. I'm trying to chat out today. But she and her are my pronouns. I am with the Colorado Department of Transportation, the Chief Equity Officer. I just started in December, so excited to be here and support everyone that I can in our efforts around environmental justice and equity. In terms of what I'm thankful, I think for me, every day I'm just thankful to be alive. I do think that and believe that every day is a gift that we are given. Something that I'm just very thankful of right now is the ability to spend time with my parents. It's a very humbling thing to see them, get older and there's that transition of age. And so being able to support them and be there for them and enjoy time, especially with my father having cancer, every minute that we have with him is precious. So I'm just very thankful to have the opportunity to spend time with them right now and appreciate that. Oh, I gotta popcorn it. Renee.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon. I'm Renee Malar-Chacon. I'm the Ne Chicana and Filipina. I represent disproportionately impacted communities in Commerce City and Indigenous communities. I work for Women from the Mountain. I go by she, her, hers. And I live for bridging literally cultural education and traditions to future generations. And right now I live for seeing the new generations born. My sister Micaela Ironshell Dominguez had a baby about a month ago, and I still need to meet her. And also I have a couple other nieces, Flor Marquez, that owns Alchemy Ritual Goods, had a baby as well too. So I have a whole lot of nieces and nephews to meet. So that's so worth seeing and living for. I will popcorn too. I'm making sure, did everybody go already?
think maybe Jamie and Gary are left, and then our EJ unit staff as well.
Jamie, please.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everyone. Excuse me, I'm trying to scarf down some lunch as well, so I'll be off camera for a little while. But my name is Jamie Valdez, or Jaime. I go by both and have grown up answering to both, so I don't necessarily have a preference. I am with Mothers Out Front. I'm a community organizer with Mothers Out Front, which is a climate justice organization founded and led by women, mothers. I also come from a disproportionately impacted community, Pueblo, Colorado. I'm a Pueblo native and Pueblo homeowner, as well as a parent and grandparent. And that, I guess, is really what makes me happy, is doing my part to hopefully ensure that my grandkids and future generations can have a world where they can all live and thrive along with all of your future generations. And I really love the way Beatriz put the being a good ancestor. So thank you for that. Oh, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who else was left.
How about we go with Gary?
Good afternoon, Gary Arnold. I'm the business manager of Pipefitters Local 208, and I get the pleasure of representing workers. Everybody had really good things listed. Trisha, I love the Olympics, super excited that since you already took that one. Right now, we're working on launching a brand new college, Western States College of Construction. We're the first apprenticeship programs anywhere in the country to get accreditation by the American Council for Construction Education. And so the aim is to provide access to associates and ultimately bachelor's degrees to anybody that wants to get into the construction industry. And so excited because it's a new structure, a new format, you know, taking the financial kind of burden away and out of the situation. And training people on new technologies that I think are going to help lower emissions too. So very excited. And I will go to Natalie, is at the very top of the screen for me.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, everybody. I'm Natalie Eddy. I'm the Air Quality Liaison with CDPHE's Environmental Justice Unit. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today. I think the thing that's bringing me my most recent joy was a beautiful bluebird kind of a weekend with my kids. I live in Leadville, so playing in the snow and just being very thankful to be so lucky to live in Colorado and raise my kids here. I will hand it over to Joel.
Good afternoon. I'm Joel Miner. I use he, him, and él pronouns. I am the manager of the Environmental Justice Unit, which means I get to work with our whole team. Something that is bringing me joy right now, there have been a lot of really wonderful, serious things shared, but I'll share a more lighthearted one, which is that I've been a big fan of RuPaul's Drag Race for many, many years. And like many reality TV shows, it's been sort of lagging in quality lately, but season 14 has just brought it back up to the level it once was at. It's just every week I have a little something to look forward to with the queens showing off their talents. So that's been a really wonderful source of joy for me lately. And I will tag Rosario.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rosario Rossi. I use she, Esha. I was born and raised in Uruguay in South America, and I'm the translation and interpretation specialist with the Environmental Justice Unit. And I'm very excited to welcome the new lunar year, the Year of the Tiger, tomorrow, and especially because we're going to be welcoming a little member in our family this year, a little tiger. So I'm very excited about that. And I'll pass it to Holly.
I think the last person that we have is Emily.
Okay.
Holly, I think Holly's introduced herself in the chat. Thank you, Holly.
Okay.
And so we'll just hear from Emily.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Splittick. I'm an attorney in the Colorado Attorney General's office. I go by she, her pronouns. And my job or my role in this is to be an advisor on legal issues to the task force. So I'll just be kind of listening in today and chiming in as needed. Hopefully you won't need me very much, but something that I am excited about and makes me happy to be alive is the snow that's coming our way in a couple days. I really like snow and I'm just looking forward to getting out there and doing something fun, maybe taking my kids sledding. They really seem to enjoy it. So.
Awesome. Thanks for introducing yourselves. Great. So lovely round of introductions. Very fun to hear what people are excited about and what is giving people life. I really love the wide array of responses. And thank you to Kelly, Jared, Holly, and Dawn for introducing themselves in the chat and for answering the icebreaker question. All right, so with that, we can go ahead and get started with our meeting now that we know who all is in the room. Just wanted to provide like kind of a quick summary of what's been going on with the task force over the past couple of weeks. Just so you all know, the Best Practices for Community Engagement Subcommittee met a couple of weeks ago. Joel's subcommittee of defining disproportionately impacted community met as well. And so this is the third subcommittee that we are, subcommittee meeting that we are hosting. Natalie, by the way, is the facilitator for the Community Engagement Subcommittee. And so I will be facilitating this equity analysis subcommittee as well as the data and health disparities subcommittee meeting, which will be taking place on Monday, next Monday, February 7th. So I just wanted to provide that quick overview because we did mention that the subcommittees for the task force would be meeting between the major task force meetings. And so the main task force meeting where everybody is going to reconvene is taking place on February 22nd. And so these conversations are really meant to help inform and share during those larger meetings. So this is kind of where we're going to get into some of the details of these specific topics. As I mentioned, during this meeting, we're primarily looking for participation from task force members, the folks that introduce themselves. For members of the public that are on this call, we do encourage you to ask questions. If you have any comments, you can drop those in the chat and we will respond to those in time. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Lumna, we did just get one additional task force member who just joined us. Jordan is here, and I heard from Ian that he's having some internet issues, but we'll be here shortly.
Oh, okay, great. Welcome, Jordan. Sorry to put you on the spot, but we just did a round of introductions. So we did name, pronouns, what your affiliation is or what organization you're coming from, and what is something that makes you excited to be alive right now. So would love to hear from you as well, Jordan, right before we get started.
All right, thanks. And sorry I'm late, everybody. I'm Jordan Beasley. He, him pronouns. I work for the Department of Agriculture as the policy advisor and legislative liaison. And so I've been running around doing some of that stuff today and apologize for being late. One of the things that makes me happy to be alive right now is I have a very, very happy 7-month-old at home. And it's very, very fun to spend time with him.
That's awesome. Great. Thanks for sharing, Jordan. And as a reminder, Cameron, I saw that you just joined as members of the public. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and share your answer to the icebreaker question. What is something that makes you excited to be alive right now? All right. So with that, we can go ahead and get started. I wanted to provide a quick overview of our agenda and what we'll be discussing today. This is the Equity Analysis Subcommittee. So first and foremost, we'll want to just ground ourselves in what equity really means and what we are talking about when we mention an equity analysis. I will review our scope of work and we'll actually just switch gears from this PowerPoint and I'll do a screen share of the Environmental Justice Act. We'll look directly at the bill language to see exactly what is written in the bill for this task force and for this subcommittee. We will do a brief review of some definitions, including disproportionately impacted community, things like cumulative impacts. We'll then discuss some questions for this subcommittee to answer. Some of the questions will be just questions to ignite some conversation, and other questions will be more formal questions that, again, are written in the EJ Act that we are tasked with answering. We'll briefly review a timeline. We will then elect co-chairs and then talk next steps. One thing to note is that we will be electing co-chairs towards the end of this meeting, so please keep that in mind while you're going through this meeting for the next 2 to 3 hours. Just kind of thinking about whether you would like to run, if you would like to nominate somebody. Just to be clear, in terms of environmental justice unit staff roles, I am facilitating. Natalie is our Zoom manager, so she'll be managing the chat, dropping links in the chat. And when we get to the time of elections, you can either drop your nominations. Well, you can drop your nominations really at any time throughout the meeting, but you can drop your nominations in the chat. If you don't want your nomination or self-nomination to be public, you can send that as a direct message to Natalie. Try not to send it to me because as I'm facilitating, it's kind of hard for me to keep up with the chat sometimes. And then Joel is taking extensive notes throughout this meeting. So worry not that your brilliant ideas aren't being captured. They're certainly being captured, and we'll distribute those notes once we've kind of cleaned them up and have them ready to go. All right. So as we get started, I also want to do a brief review of our roles, kind of really understanding who's who in all of this. I did just share what the EJ unit staff will be doing during this meeting. But just to make it clear, we want to make today's meeting as productive as possible. This is our first equity analysis subcommittee meeting. And we have built the framework for today's conversation because we want to have a place to start. Nothing, at least in my opinion, is worse like than coming to a meeting and people being like, so what do you think? And it's a totally blank slate. So we have shared some ideas, some outlines, but it is really up to you all as task force members to fill in the gaps, to provide your opinions, your ideas. What we are sharing here are just suggestions and kind of guidelines based off the Environmental Justice Act and what is written in there. But you all have been hand selected. You've been appointed to be on this subcommittee. And so we really are looking for your input. And we really want you all to feel empowered to present your ideas and share. And going forward as your staff, our role is to make sure that we are capturing those ideas and making what you are suggesting happen. So we are kind of the facilitators and the people moving the work along. Okay. So as we start to talk about an equity analysis, I wanted to ground us in understanding really why this matters. And by creating an equity analysis, what we are really setting out to do here is uplifting communities that are ultimately disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and the effects of climate change, and to help with climate and environmental mitigation and community resiliency. That is kind of what the whole purpose is of us kind of discussing an equity analysis. In talking about an equity analysis, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what equity is. There's a really short 1-minute video here. Many of you might have seen this already. This is through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but a good little animation that especially highlights the difference between equality and equity. And I'll go ahead and play this. Maybe Joel, if you could just give me a thumbs up and make sure that you can hear the audio, that would be great.
I don't think we hear the audio. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll go ahead and restart that. Let's see here. I think, Natalie, I might need your assistance in terms of getting audio for this video.
What can I do, Lubna?
You may need to stop sharing your screen and then reshare it. And when you reshare, down at the bottom, there should be two options. One for share audio and the other one says enhance for video. If you click enhance for video, it will automatically click the share audio one, and that should allow you to share your sound as well.
Okay. I'm not seeing any video audio options. So Jamie, you were saying that if you go to the bottom and hit share screen, that it should be there.
When you have the option to select which window or tab you want to share, in that little dialog box, there should be at the bottom a couple of options. Now, it may be different if you're on an Apple device, so I'm not sure how that works with Apple products, but on PC with Zoom, when you go to share your screen, you should have options to share audio and enhance for video.
Okay. Joel, I see that you just messaged me. Are you able to get to that setting? Because I'm not seeing it on my end.
I can give it a try. Yeah, I think it may be hidden. So do you want me to go ahead and try that?
Sure, yeah. And you can go ahead and share the audio for that video.
But I'm getting a message that a plugin may be required. Let me try this one more time.
These days, we hear a lot of people using the word equity. But what does it really mean?
Are you all hearing that? Okay, great.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Also get the screen shared, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna start it again. So just let me know if you can hear this.
Now we can't hear it, we can see it.
Okay, well, maybe I can work on troubleshooting in the background. And does that sound good while we move on? I apologize.
Yeah, that sounds good. And actually, I might try one last thing, which is just pulling up the YouTube video itself. So let me try that as a last resort and see if this works. Any luck? No audio? Okay. That is fine. We will go ahead and move on. Apologies for that. Let's see. Okay, we still have some technical Zoom stuff we need to figure out. I'm just trying to figure out how to progress this slide now. Okay, so essentially in summary, when we're talking about equity, we are talking about everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, and ensuring that these folks have the opportunity to thrive. The video that I was going to share with you just kind of shows how, in order to create an equitable environment, we need to have different resources for different people because everybody is different. And so the animation kind of shows you different people using different types of bikes, not the same bike for different people. So in terms of providing equity, we are trying to eliminate barriers like poverty and repairing injustices in systems like education, the education system, the health system, transportation. In our case, we're primarily focusing on environmental equity, which I'd like to note intersects a lot with health equity. So we will naturally talk about those two things in tandem. But when we are thinking about equity and how every person is different and needs different resources to thrive, and an environmental equity analysis, therefore, is a framework that will help guide agencies. In our case, we are a state agency to protect our most disproportionately impacted populations from environmental hazards, as well as help them gain access to environmental benefits, regardless of their income, their race, and any other characteristics. So with that said, I want to also go over our different objectives of this subcommittee. These are really basic objectives. They're not defined. They're not necessarily SMART, but I do want to just share kind of the gist of what we are trying to do. So in terms of scope of work, and in terms of our roles here, we're not actually creating an equity analysis over the next few months, but rather we're looking at big picture concepts, including whether or not we should have an environmental equity analysis and why, and to what extent we are formulating recommendations for the legislature based off of that. So I'd like to take a moment to review the language regarding equity analysis that comes directly from the Environmental Justice Act, which is also something that will just help us understand what an equity analysis is and what it's intended to do. So I'm going to go ahead and actually share the bill language. And if you would like to follow along on your own, Natalie has dropped a link to the bill in the chat. So that is the same screen that you're looking at right now. We're going to the bottom of page 10 of the EJ Act, where the section starts off with the duties of the task force. And we're gonna skip down to recommendations for creating and implementing equity analysis. And so we're gonna just go through this section right here and kind of and read out the language that is written into the bill. So the task force is tasked with making recommendations for creating and implementing an equity analysis into all significant planning, rulemaking, adjudications, orders, programmatic and policy decision-making, and investments. A potential requirement that agencies prepare an environmental equity analysis for any state action that has the potential to cause negative environmental or public health impacts to a disproportionately impacted community, which analysis could include a process for identifying and describing cumulative impacts to the health and environment of disproportionately impacted communities. And keep in mind that we're going to do a deep dive into the language in this bill, everything from disproportionately impacted community to proposed state action. So just letting you all know that. Third, a potential requirement that for any state action that may cause adverse environmental or public health impacts to a disproportionately impacted community, the adverse environmental or public health must be avoided. And if the effects cannot be avoided, they must be minimized and mitigated. A potential requirement that permits must be issued and renewed only after an environmental equity analysis determines that the terms and conditions of the permit or renewal are sufficient to ensure to a reasonable certainty that any harm to the health and environment of disproportionately impacted communities is either avoided or minimized to the extent practicable, and to the extent any harms remain is mitigated. So that covers kind of what brought us into this subcommittee. And again, if you want to look at this language on your own time, this is on the bottom of page 10 going into page 11. and is really like our guiding light when we're thinking about an equity analysis and what are the different factors that we are looking at in developing recommendations for an equity analysis. All right, so I'm not actually going to do much more of a screen share right now, other than the fact that we want to get this conversation started. We want to hear from you all, and there are a number of questions that we've posed for you all to answer. And we thought a good way to start off this kind of, again, we're trying to create an environment where we're having a pretty informal conversation here where you all feel comfortable in contributing. So we thought a good way to kick off the conversation is with a poll. Hopefully we do not have technical difficulties doing this, but we do have a poll ready for you all. And the poll question is, how familiar are you with an equity analysis? This is really just to gain an understanding of your expertise, your background, your comfortability. So are you very, very familiar? Have you worked in developing an equity analysis? Are you kind of somewhat familiar in that you know what an equity analysis is, but maybe you could learn more? Being right in the middle, knowing that you could really broaden your understanding of an equity analysis. Just having heard of an equity analysis, but not really knowing what it is and what it entails. And then lastly, it is totally fine to say, hey, I don't know anything about an equity analysis. I saw the content for the subcommittee. It looked interesting. I wanted to learn. And so knowing very well that it is okay to respond with that as well. But we just wanted to see what the expertise was like in the room. Okay, I think that is pretty much everybody that is on the task force that has participated. I think that's everyone, but we can just give it a few more seconds and then we'll end the poll. Okay, I can go ahead and end this poll and share these results. All right, can everybody see this okay? All right, so in terms of the task force members that are in the room, it looks like 15 people answered the question. So in terms of how familiar are you with an equity analysis? A couple people said they're very familiar. 3 people said, I know what an equity analysis is. The majority of folks, 6 out of 15, said I could broaden my understanding of equity analysis. And then 4 people said, I've heard of an equity analysis, but don't really know what it is. So that's a pretty broad range. It is great to see that, while we welcome people to feel vulnerable and share that if they did not know what an equity analysis is, it sounds like everybody here does know what it is. Some people have a strong expertise. Some people feel there is a lot of room to grow and learn. So hopefully that is something that can help inform our conversation and help us kind of understand the starting point for a lot of people in the room. All right, and then before we jump into some questions for conversation, I do want to mention that for those who want to expand their understanding of what an equity analysis is, or maybe look at some examples, we have some examples for you that we will drop in the chat. I can share some of these in an email afterwards, or you all can click on the links now and bookmark those tabs if you're interested. But this is just for folks that might be interested in seeing, hey, what does an equity analysis that one that's already established look like? Some of these resources go through the process of what these groups did to create these equity analyses. And so I would encourage you to check out some of these resources. Some are from the EPA Region 8 on their Safe Drinking Water Act, all the way down to a racial equity action framework that is meant to really help inform these different organizations in their work. All right, so to get us started, and I'm not going to be doing a screen share for the next half hour or so. Again, we are really looking for task force participation. If you do have the ability to come off to put your camera on, that would be great. I know there's a number of people trying to wrap up lunch, and that's fine if you're not able to share your screen or to share your video. But we do encourage people to share their video and to come off mute to participate. The first question I wanted to ask is, what do you think the benefits are of a equity analysis? Very basic question, but really wanted to hear from task force members in the room about what do you think the benefits are of an equity analysis? And you can definitely feel free to share in the chat, including our members of the public, but would love to hear from any task force members. And you can just come directly off of mute or raise your hand. And Natalie has dropped that question in the chat as well. What do you think the benefits are of an equity analysis? And again, Joel will be taking notes throughout this section. Thanks, Renee. So Renee mentioned before talks of equality, there has to be equity. Others, what do you think the benefits are of an equity analysis?
Sorry, I also was eating really quick. Yeah, just to elaborate on that, for disproportionately impacted communities, even from I was reminded recently at a conference, is it's either equity or environmental issues. And when we're in this space for disproportionately impacted communities, it's both. For starting with Indigenous communities, there was land stolen, there were resources stolen. Equity is built on the very property and sources of life that we use. So being mindful that equity starts with the origin of even our no tree honored of our Constitution, of how so many things are built in this country socioeconomically and what's dependent on it and who's dependent on it and also who's marginalized, that before you have talks of equality, you have to have talks of equity or where there's been lack of equity and gaps in it.
Thanks, Renee. Love that. Others. So what are we doing here in this subcommittee? What are the benefits of even creating an equity analysis? Ian, I see your hand is up and I will have you go next. And Ian joined just a few minutes late. And so Ian, if I could have you introduce yourself and your pronouns and kind of what your affiliation is or what group you're coming from. And also feel free to answer the icebreaker question from earlier, which is, what is something that is making you excited to be alive right now? So I will go to Ian to introduce himself and share his thoughts, and then Jamie, and then Trisha.
Okay, my name is Ian Thomas Tafoya, he, him, L. I'm the Colorado State Director for Green Latinos. I'm coming down from the foothills where I was meeting with a conservation education organization and building partnerships. So that's really exciting for the Latino community. And, you know, the equity analysis, when I think of it, it's to inform the decision makers, and to piggyback off of what Renee says, it's like we need to have people in power at the decision-making process, but to really have the great outcomes. But at a minimum, it's really to provide a more holistic picture. The things we fought for, like cumulative health, pollution assessments, these kinds of things, or so that we can make better outcomes at the end, that don't leave out the pieces that have been missing that have resulted in the environmental racism for so long. And, you know, whether it's denial of permits, all these things, there needs to be a bridge, and I am hoping that the analysis will create pathways for that.
Thanks, Ian. That's super informative. Jamie.
In response to the question of the benefits of equity analysis, I was going to suggest that it provides the ability to assess the needs of each individual or community, so we can respond according to those needs, keeping in mind that equity is really based on individual needs. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is a really key point, right? Equity is based on individual needs, right? Going back to the point of we are all different. We all have different needs. Trisha.
Yeah, my thoughts were really similar to both Jamie and Ian. I guess I was kind of reflecting, like, as an agency, as we approach rules or approach permits or actions from that perspective with regulated entities, we're often thinking about consistency, right? But an equity analysis would give agencies the ability to apply a different lens, right? And not necessarily have to apply the same outcome, because that's not equitable, right? It has led to disproportionate impacts. And so I think an equity analysis would really give us the ability to start to address that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Trisha. Mira.
Yeah, I would say it's a fundamental aspect of any policy making, not just environmental, to examine who benefits from a policy and who is harmed by a policy. I think, particularly related to the environmental sphere or the climate sphere, there's a particular historical environmental harm occurring to marginalized or disproportionately impacted communities. So I remember reading a ProPublica article published recently that found that majority Black communities are twice as likely to have a cancer risk from nearby pollution that exceeds the EPA acceptable limit as majority white communities. So in light of this sort of particular environmental harm occurring to marginalized and disproportionately impacted communities, I think it's extra important to have that more formalized assessments of benefits and harms coming from climate and other environmental policies.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Mira. Tyson.
Yeah, I really think the ability to provide data is the only way that people can make educated decisions on what the effects of something being implemented are, no matter what that something is. And I think in this country, one of our largest issues is we're always reactive to something that happens, right? I mean, you look at what happened. My parents lived in Ohio for a long time, so I learned about the Great Lakes and how they treated the Great Lakes. And then it was like, oh, we have all this pollution, Great Lakes, it's terrible. What do we do? Oh, now let's fix it. Well, being able to evaluate that through data and understanding what the cause and effect will be on all aspects, not just one thing or another, but actually try to put a holistic view on something, really will allow people to make educated guesses on it. Or really educated guesses, but an educated guess is better than no guess at all, right? You have to make some assumptions when you make decisions, no matter what. But having data to back up those decisions to make sure you're putting it together in a sensible manner will prevent a lot of the reactive decisions. Instead, we'll be making proactive decisions that I think having that data out in the public and the way data moves and information moves these days, it will allow people who cannot supply that data, go fund that data, go get representation on that data, to have the data and be able to speak up on their own behalf, which is a huge part of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, emphasis on data, that's really key. And I really like your point about kind of the holistic view, looking at everything. Arthur.
The part that I'm struggling with is, with an equity analysis to be beneficial, we have to keep in mind who is going to be viewing it, right? Like an equity analysis for the community is going to look different than an equity analysis for state lawmakers or local lawmakers, right? Because it is a framework. And so I think being clear on who we are, if we are going to create an equity analysis, who's it's for and why, will be helpful, because I think we could easily get into boiling the ocean here, right? Like everything everyone said is super important, but creating, all the data to understand equity just in, say, a community, that's a massive undertaking. Is that what we're here to do? Are we here to provide that framework that, say, the state legislature, the General Assembly, or CDPHE, or whatever entity is going to be using this framework to go and then achieve those goals. So I just want to be clear on who are we creating the framework for, because I think that's going to drive whether what we create is beneficial or not.
Yeah, that's a great point, Arthur. Like setting up parameters, right, for figuring out who is the equity analysis serving, which that is the following question, which we'll get to in just a bit. But yeah, thinking about kind of what are some guidelines that we can provide for ourselves to not stretch the equity analysis too thin, and ensure that we're within certain parameters that are achieving goals that we're setting out to accomplish. Kimberly.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is along the lines of where I think Arthur was going a little bit, but I think an equity analysis, starting with that question, knowing that we're going to move on to other questions, is exactly that. If you're looking at it on a permit basis versus an overall policy basis, those look different, but regardless of either one and how you're looking at it, it is really helpful in terms of understanding who those impacted folks are in each individual piece that you're looking at. And again, a permit is going to be much different than a state policy in terms of what that equity analysis looks like, but it does sort of force up front to have that really robust analysis of who you need to engage with, and talking about sort of what those best practices look like when we were talking about that before, and how that sort of plays into however you put the analysis together for whatever component you're looking at it from that perspective. So I think it gives us an opportunity to be really proactive in outreach and understanding the communities that are impacted for any particular policy or permit.
Yeah, great points. Thanks, Kimberly. And I just want to lift up that something that Renee mentioned, especially while Arthur was talking about providing a framework and kind of what exactly are we trying to accomplish with the equity analysis. And Renee mentioned filling in data gaps, which is clearly a major point that Tyson also mentioned, and Ian, I saw that you like that as well. And Renee, I'm seeing in the chat, it would have to see who is unaccounted for in their public health and safety from potentially industries because of historical marginalization and socioeconomic barriers. Great points. Anybody else that wants to mention or provide a response to the question of what do you think the benefits are of an equity analysis? Beatriz.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that we're thinking, how we fairly distribute the consequences and the benefits of our regulatory agencies. And kind of going to Arthur's point, I think it's really important that if we're going to have citizens that are engaged and informed in agencies, we have to start to think about how we connect all these dots and allow more people to actively participate in the impacts to their health and their well-being and their environment. And what we failed in the past is that we silo and we make things so complex and so hard for engagement. So I invite all of us to really think, how can we allow more people to participate actively and how these agencies are impacting their lives, obviously backed up with data and backed up with facts, but also thinking about kind of shifting the paradigm of how we work and how we connect with communities.
Yeah, really great points, Beatriz. Thank you so much for sharing. Gary.
I don't have a whole lot to add because I think, the various committee members have made excellent points. Just again on the basic surface is recognizing that, we've had a focus on equality and really that focus is trying to give everybody the same equal opportunity to weigh in on the development of public policy. And that's ignored the fact that various demographics have historically been negatively affected and not had really the same, we're not all starting from the same starting point. And whether you look at their ability to engage in the development of public policy, having public comment sessions in the middle of a weekday, obviously there's large amount of folks that don't have access, that they have to work, they have weekly bill, monthly bills that come first. And so I think an equity analysis is recognizing that nobody, not everybody starting from the same point, developing a very transparent public process to Tyson's point, that allows us to share the data and facts to justify making decisions based off specific demographics that are either negatively effective or stand up, have positive outcomes. And really showing that, that is what equity is, and just standing back and saying everybody had the same equal chance doesn't necessarily lead to the best development of public policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everybody is definitely not starting at the same point. That's a great point to highlight. Ian.
Well, in the comments when I put the plus, that was actually to what Arthur had to say, which was about who are the decision makers that we're empowering with this information. And I want to take it a step further to say, like, how does it empower them to make the right decision? Because there are many opportunities or examples, where we've turned out a lot of people in the name of equity to change the tide for our communities, and yet the decision makers rule against what the community is asking for. And so how do we talk about creating a rule that targets the decision makers and actually empowers them to do the right thing, not just check a box that an equity analysis was done and then they add to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I welcome others to kind of tack that on to the conversation that we're having right now. Right, we're talking about an equity analysis pretty broadly, but Ian is bringing up the question of, who are the decision makers and how can we empower them to make the right decisions? So great question, Ian, to add on to the conversation. Arthur and then Mira.
Yeah, I appreciate that nod, Ian, because once again, depending on who the audience is and what the goals are from this task force and the subcommittee, the equity analysis that I've seen that are like 80 pages those are dense, they're difficult to read. That's not going to inform our legislators as much as we believe and hope it will. And so I think part of this needs to be, if that's who we're targeting, we need to create the materials and the information that floods into that like framework is usable for legislator, policymakers, state agencies, whoever we culture, society, because I think there's some onus there as well, right? So I think I'm scared of producing an 80-page outline document that is not going to really be truly useful, even though it has a lot of very awesome information.
Yeah, that's a great point, Arthur. Even just sharing the barriers with the length of a document, even some of the examples that I've shared with you earlier today, Joel and I found those examples of different equity analyses and shared them with you all to look at. But they are, some of them are really dense. They're hundreds and hundreds of pages. And so at best, I imagine most of you will kind of look at the summary. You might look at a framework that's like highly visual or outlined. But I totally agree that, having a dense document, something that's extremely long, the length in itself might be a deterrent. So it's something for us to consider. Mira.
Yeah, I think that Ian's and Arthur's points really get at a question that I was thinking about around the scope of work from 1266 for the equity analysis, which is largely focused on creating the equity analysis itself. It also references some requirements that harms be avoided in various policy decision making. But I also can encourage us to think broadly about, okay, so we're producing these equity analyses as part of various decision-making procedures, but how then should the equity analysis be incorporated into those decision-making procedures, and what kinds of recommendations can we make around the process by which this goes from a report to actionable recommendations that are adopted by decision makers. So that's, that's something that I really think it's kind of a gap in the current scope of work, and I'd really encourage us to consider it broadly in this subcommittee.
Very important consideration, right? Just not looking at the immediate end goal for this group, which is developing recommendations, but how is this actually going to be implemented, and building that into the recommendations in themselves. Tricia.
I guess on the same theme, and just to make sure that I understand, I guess I was seeing the goal of this group, like and there were some comments about like, we don't want to come out of this with a 80-page, really dense report or analysis. And while I totally agree with that, I guess I sort of see our charge less about doing an equity analysis and more about like having the conversation about when should one occur, what would it look like, and then to Mira's point, not only like when should it occur and what would it look like, but then how is it taken into account in decision making. So I guess I just wanted to make sure I'm understanding kind of what our task is.
Yeah, great question. Tyson?
And to continue on that same note, kind of what Mira and Tricia were saying, I think one of my big questions is, where we want to set broad parameters, right? That they can make some decisions on how to move forward with an equity analysis. One of the major concerns about that is time. From either side, any side you look at this from, the amount of time that it takes to do the equity analysis could be the difference between people understanding what's going on before it gets too far down the road, especially when it comes to public policy and appropriations and all of the things that happen, through government-funded projects. There's time limits on this stuff, and sometimes things need to be done in a short period of time. And a lot of times that's when mistakes happen, is when things go fast. But that's the process that's in place that can't really be changed. So I'd hate to start an equity analysis, have them start an equity analysis and, hey, we're going to vote on this tomorrow. Oh, by the way, here's the finished equity analysis. That doesn't really help anybody. They got to be able to get that data and get that information soon enough. So at what point, maybe in the scope of this thing, it's not one analysis. Maybe there's different tiers of analysis that could be put in for timing purposes, because you want to make sure that you can get as much information to the people that need it as quickly as possible, understanding that in order to get 100% of the information might not always be achievable. Just a thought, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia and Tyson. Thinking about the timeline of this, that might be a consideration for us in writing the recommendations is, do we want to provide guidance on when the equity analysis should be implemented? Will the can get kicked down the road, or are we going to set some kind of timeline parameters around this? And Tyson already thinking about the structure, different tiers of the equity analysis. How do we want to organize it? Do we want to break it down by different sections? So great thoughts around that. Beatriz?
I want to say I appreciate that, because even like thinking of the word equity and trying to meet people where they are, not everybody has the same urgency. Not all are impacted the same way. Not everybody receives information in the same way. And we didn't get to hear your video, but we saw people with different physical characteristics. And I think it's the same about sharing this information, right? And I think it's also our responsibility to think about how can this be used for multiple things without creating too much work, but baking in the equity of access to information to stakeholders, policymakers, the community, the disproportionately impacted community as well.
Yeah, great point in reiteration. I saw that there's some comments in the chat, and I just wanted to see if any folks wanted to elaborate on anything there. Renee, you posed the question of how do we make decision makers accountable for community? Does anybody want to share any thoughts around that?
Voting.
Arthur said voting.
Looking past voting too, though, because that doesn't account for immigrant communities and so many others too, especially Indigenous communities that don't trust that type of system.
Yeah. Arthur.
I mean, I appreciate that, but that's what you're asking here, right? Like these rulemakers are not being held account to the community in this discussion. And they're there because they're voted. They're there because we put them there, right? That's what motivates that. I get that they need to recalibrate, reassess that, but at this moment.
Then I guess being accountable to the community with a human rights aspect too, where it goes past voting, but to the actual people in the space and the biosphere in the space. Because if we only make them accountable, it's still focused on a political aspect and how they appeal to socioeconomic, small business, to some degree, industry, to where it'll always not be equitable. It'll innately not be that by a system. So looking how we can look past that, but to the actual biosphere and the human rights in the space, whether they vote for you or not, you're still accountable to the living people there.
I think that's one of our societal issues is that we really do rely on strictly on the voting system and how that goes, and a lot of times that just doesn't pan out, right? There are certain things that affect a certain community that can't be supported by certain constituents because they're part of a broader constituency, and that's harmful. So from this point, I really think that being able to, I think a key aspect of this would be who are your, interested parties, and that's your most affected parties, and have that be a key element to what drives, in this particular situation, the CDPHE, to hold those people up and listen to what they're saying when we're going through, let's say we're moving a highway through a neighborhood. Well, everybody listens to how it's going to financially impact the entire state and how it's going to impact everybody else, 40, 60, 70 miles away. But, what happens right there in that community? And now the CDPHE has the opportunity to say, okay, this is that community. I want to hear their voice. I want to hear what's happening. And that's the way you can give a voice. But there has to be participation. I think the communications committee, subcommittee, which I'm not on, but I know that they're working hard to figure out how to get information out. But they should also be thinking about how to get information back and how to get reports back and how to develop rapport with these communities so they do feel confident that their voice will be heard when they come talk and when they come to public comments or send a representative to a public comment. This is not something that's going to be solved by us writing a few things down and getting it done. This is a long process. This is decades and decades and decades of processes that need to be tweaked and changed and rewritten in some cases. And we're going to have to go through that process. But I think the first step is just identifying who are the important voices that need to be heard, and making sure that, again, in line with the act, we are avoiding or to the maximum amount possible mitigating or minimizing those additional impacts.
Yeah, absolutely, Tyson. And I feel like a lot of folks are kind of like inching towards our next question, which is who do we want the equity analysis to benefit? And so I will just put that out there in addition to our other question of who do we think, what do we think the benefits of an equity analysis are? So in addition to that, who do we want an equity analysis to benefit? And I know folks might have already formulated their thoughts based on the conversation that's happening. So feel free to share kind of what you already had in mind. Arthur, then Kim, then Ian.
I mean, I think that question you just added gets there, but I think we need to decide who is the equity analysis for, because the conversation we're having, or like that Renee and Tyson and I guess I were having there, was like, there's the societal part, there is the decision policy elected side. And if we are going to try to inform that these folks versus these folks, that's going to change how we build this. That's to Trisha's point, that like how we build this thing and the parameters we give to those who actually fill it in are going to matter, because we need to know who we're, because like Tyson said, like participation and voting are kind of two sides of the same coin here, right? You're not going to get the electeds to pay attention unless you participate. But who are we guiding this discussion towards? And I think that's a part that's missing for me. And it's going to be hard to have these kind of conversations on like, who's it going to benefit, if we need to know who we're pointing it at first. Who's going to be viewing? Who's going to look through this lens? That will, I think, help me understand who we're going to benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's kind of the difficulty in having kind of this like linear conversation. And so I encourage for this to be, you know, for folks to be kind of thinking about these questions and answering them all at the same time. We will be talking about that a little bit later, about kind of like what proposed state action means and what agencies this equity analysis will apply to. And, you know, the short answer is that it is really up to you all to decide who the equity analysis will be for. And so that is something for you all to consider, you know, and if that's something that we have strong opinions about here and have ideas about, I encourage you to share them as well. Kimberly.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I was going to. I'm struggling a little bit because a state agency action, I mean, there's a broad scope of those. And so an equity analysis for a state agency action on a rule or a policy that has an impact versus a state action on a specific, you know, permit or specific project, as Tyson was going to, you know, if you're moving a highway, there are those impacted communities that are along that, and then there's the broader state impact of that project as well. And so I think equity, if we're talking about when an equity analysis is required, you know, when it's required for a state action or a policy action that's broader, you know, that is a different subset of folks that are going to benefit from that analysis versus those who are directly impacted by a specific project that the state has to take action on. And so I think that goes back to, I guess, how do you hold people accountable, or how do you hold the decision makers accountable on that? You know, there's an easier way to incorporate accountability in a state action, again, say on a permit, because you're looking at a very specific impact to that surrounding community. And I think that you can put a framework and an analysis together that holds that accountability of what you have to look for and who you have to engage with and what conversations you have to have specific to that. Again, I don't know. I guess the question for me, for the broader committee, is are we looking at equity analysis frameworks for different types of state action? And I think there's the ability to do that. It's just obviously it's a bigger thing for us to all take on. If we have to put a framework together for a broad state action for a policy versus a framework for CDPHE, for example, to look at a permit specific state action.
Yeah, certainly. And folks who have their hands raised, you can go ahead and speak. I don't want to kind of be inserting myself into every conversation, especially as like the conversation's going. I'm kind of imagining us, if we were in person, like being at a round table, I wouldn't be like interjecting between each person. So feel free to kind of jump to the next person. Natalie, thanks for putting the order in the chat, but we can see kind of who's in line to go next. So Ian, then Renee, then Trisha, then Gary, and feel free to kind of just run with the thoughts and not wait for me to call on you.
Okay. Well, first I would agree that it comes back to that tiered conversation about whether you're talking about policy, rulemaking, or whatever. It seems to me, at least in my experience engaging in different agencies, that the first tier of people that need to be influenced is the staff, because the staff make recommendations that both elected leaders and appointed commissioners often lean into. And we've had a very hard time actually, if the staff doesn't come down on the same time as us, being able to actually influence a different outcome from the commission. So I definitely think staff is an audience that is probably one of the first steps in the whole conversation to turn it into different outcomes. I also think that a really strong and makes sense on how the actual equity process is going to go might help industry as well, because to give you an example, you know, if all of a sudden it's cumulative pollution that's being addressed, well, it's easy for them to tell whether or not they would make a decision to sink a well in a certain place or do whatever. And then in Tyson's question, I heard about balancing economic benefit versus health. I think that frontline communities, and we've had the success, look at SB 181, we've made clear health and safety first, that's the balance we want for the people who are being most impacted. And then my last thought is just where does accountability fit in for commissioners who are appointed? Representative voting.
Ian, you dropped off a little bit as you were making your last point. Your connection seems like it might be spotty.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was saying, how do we accountability into the conversation to appointed commissioners where voting isn't a level of accountability that people have to check that?
Okay, I think I caught the last part of what you were saying, but how do we bring accountability into conversation for appointed commissioners when they aren't voted in? I think that was the last thing that Ian said. Thanks for that, Ian. Renee.
I really appreciate someone mentioning who are the interested parties, because that's how you go from there, even for communities. So as Beatrice was already mentioning about more implementation and just representation of communities, they environmentally kind of set the stage for everyone too. With more community monitoring opening up, we have a lot of, and then scientists even on the ground too, already giving a lot of spaces too for grassroots level. There's a lot to be said for enveloping community as more participants in their space and hold more weight in that space too. And then for equity, using it as a duality. Remembering that we can use these conversations of, yes, voting and socioeconomic impacts cumulatively as one space, but that only accounts for economic benefits. Health and safety does have to still be priority over that too. I completely agree, and I would point with that too. So maybe just looking at how we can still resource community too in some aspects, and also being participants, and that it shouldn't just be so linear in how we look at everything, doing things with more context, if any of that makes sense.
Just jumping in here. So, I mean, as I'm listening to the conversation, it certainly occurs to me that there's they are different questions if you ask who will benefit from an equity analysis versus who is sort of who is the author, but also who's the audience and who will use it in decision making. Because I mean, to me, though, I think those are different questions with different answers. And I guess the other comment I wanted to make is, like I see the task force's charge here, you know, from the Environmental Justice Act is, you know, right now, you know, state agency is defined pretty narrowly, right? It's not just within CDPHE, but it's really focused on air quality. And so to me, I think, you know, part of this discussion of equity analysis is you know, in the language that you showed, that you've pointed us to earlier, Lubna, to ground us, and the statutory language is about, you know, which permitting decisions or rulemaking decisions or adjudicatory decisions, like when should equity analysis be done. But I also see a question of like, and in by which agencies, right? Should it just be air quality? Should it just be CDPHE, or should it be broader than that? I mean, people were using an example of a highway, like that's not really a CDPHE decision, right? So I think that's another topic that I think that would be good for us to talk about over the course of the next however many months.
as most cases, Tricia said all that much better than I could try to. So I agree with all those points. I think the benefit should be to the disproportionately impacted communities as the number one priority, overall. And then I think, secondly, I think it does benefit the decision makers. And I say that in, it should be informing them on the record about the possible outcomes of whatever decision they're getting ready to make. And whether that be elected officials or appointed folks, I would like to believe that they're making their votes and their decisions ultimately based off the information that they have at hand and what's been presented to them. Unfortunately, I think in some cases, the equity analysis hasn't been there to inform them, and it makes it tough to hold them accountable at the end of the day, because you're asking them, why did you take this stance? Why did you make this decision? One, we just need to make sure that they're having all the information, that those disproportionately impacted communities, stand to have either a negative or a positive outcome, and that should be weighed into the ultimate decision on whatever is being decided or whatever is being voted on. So I think, number one priority is disproportionately impacted communities, and then two, making sure that we're utilizing that efficiently in informing our decision-making process.
Yeah, I think, I guess I see the primary audience for these recommendations as being the decision makers. And to reiterate my previous comment, I would hope that our recommendations would have some language on how these decision makers, both at the staff level and at the commission level, should be considering the outcomes or the recommendations from the equity analyses that are created. At the same time, I think the equity analysis is going to inform engagement at the community level. It can inform community members, and I think there's also a feedback loop, and this sort of relates to the work of the best practices for engaging communities subcommittee, in that there should be a feedback loop between the community and the equity analysis, such that the equity analysis is informing the community, but also community engagement is informing what goes into the equity analysis and the folks who are creating that.
Yeah, great point, Mira.
I also want to add that I've heard a lot of concerns about speed and cost. And what ends up happening when we put at the forefront, keeping things really like low budget, or it has to move really quickly, we continue to perpetuate oppression and harm on these communities. This work takes investment. This work takes time, right? And if we're just rushing because it's somebody's priority, we're not thinking about that disproportionately impacted community. So these analyses are essential to every decision we make, so we are not sacrificing and overburdening the same people we have historically. And if we continue to operate in the same way and think about it, we're not going to change absolutely anything. So this is a place and a space to start thinking about that as well.
Yeah, really, really good point. I appreciate that about the urgency piece. Any others have thoughts on the questions that we have shared so far of what do you think the benefits of an equity analysis are, and then who do we want equity analysis to benefit? And I encourage folks here, we have a wide variety of, this is the largest subcommittee that we have. More than half the task force members are here. And so when we're thinking about who do we want the equity analysis to benefit, and we will get into kind of who the equity analysis is for, or who will be using the equity analysis. We'll get into that a little bit later. But in terms of who do we want it to benefit, we have talked about disproportionately impacted communities, but for the people here, if there's any specifics around that, about, from your personal experience or from your work, who do you want those people to be? I'd encourage you to share that. And I see Renee's comment in the chat: to establish community monitoring, we first have to empower, support them, and then hear their modeling input. rushing feels manipulative. All right, so I encourage people to continue thinking about answers to these questions. I wanted to also pose a question of, what are some examples of when you've seen an equity analysis used, and any success stories? You know, for the folks that are on this committee, have you seen an equity analysis used? You know, in what setting? Can you share stories? Is there anything that you would like to share with the group in terms of successes, or we can even get into kind of challenges and lessons learned? And I'll give folks a moment to kind of think about that. What are some examples of when we've seen an equity analysis used, and any sort of success stories? And taking it a step beyond that, if folks don't want to just focus on success stories, thinking about any lessons learned from past equity analyses or components of an equity analysis that doesn't, and again, we use the term equity analysis pretty fluidly. You know, this can be an environmental justice framework. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that is branded as an equity analysis, but something that resembled what you feel an equity analysis is and what it should accomplish.
I'll jump in. I don't know if I've ever seen a full comprehensive analysis done in this way, but I will say we've seen components of it, but they weren't brought together, and that's with NEPA. And that, my biggest experience with NEPA is it gives people a fighting chance for just with decisions that are being made. My experience, of course, being with the I-70 expansion, where we came up short was what we got in the settlement, which is the cumulative hard science conversation of it. So I think that if you look at the EJ for All Act, which I've mentioned before, I think it's looked at ways in which NEPA, which is close to doing a comprehensive analysis, could be improved, and comprehensive pollution is a part of that. And I think we've seen other analyses done which are more about social impacts, and that was done with GS. The hard sciences weren't meshed together. And so I think a way in which you can mesh the hard science impacts into the conversation for health is where I would see the most success, and what most frontline groups have been advocating for, at least on the federal level, for reform.
If it's okay to jump in there, you know, I do want to share that I think the examples that Lumna and I provided for you all earlier that were in the chat, many of those come from that NEPA context. And I think that they probably do share some areas of potential improvement, and that for the most part they are, as Ian mentioned, sort of a socioeconomic analysis of who is impacted and whether there is a disparate impact on the basis of race, but they don't necessarily take an additional step of always talking about ways that could be addressed or mitigated or avoided. Similarly, as Ian mentioned, often those documents are part of a much longer NEPA analysis that, if you would ever like the links to the longer NEPA analysis that is attached to the examples we provided, just let us know. Some of them are, they just do the environmental justice analysis in an appendix, but the sort of hard science where the agency is looking at impacts on soil or impacts on water that are part of that longer NEPA analysis don't always show up in the equity analysis component. It's often sort of constrained to the socioeconomic. So I just wanted to acknowledge, to Ian's point, that the examples we shared might come from the NEPA context, but that doesn't mean it's the only way or the best way of doing things. It's just some of the examples that are a little easier to find online because of sort of public records requirements and what agencies make available.
Thanks for sharing that, Joel. Anybody else others have thoughts on examples of an equity analysis or an environmental justice analysis or framework, and success stories that, you know, from your personal experience of hearing about them or being a part of those analyses, something that we can take away, something that we can share with the group here? Okay, I think we had a really, yeah, Tyson, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I guess one thing that You know, I've worked with NEPAs a lot in the past on a federal level through the oil and natural gas industry. And one thing I've seen is kind of a good, Colorado's done a good job of complementing that with work at the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission as well as the CDPHE to enhance that, right? And I think one of the things that we're learning is that from a NEPA analysis, you do get a good idea of what the impacts could be from a strictly environmental footprint situation, but what you don't have is the kind of continuous monitoring, which is something that the AQCD has done a good job of adding that. And I just went through my first experience of a natural gas well and having air monitoring on location, through the first 6 months of production, which is the most productive portion of a natural gas well. And what it does is it gives real data, right? That real data can be used to either revise those NEPAs or improve the accuracy of those NEPAs when you're looking forward. I use that example because, again, I think data is key to all of this. Everybody has ideas or thoughts on what is happening, what may be affecting them, what may not be affecting them, and most of the time there's a discrepancy or disagreement between any industry or any disproportionately impacted community or elected officials or legislative members who are pushing certain policies, is the fact that there is no data. So everybody's arguing their personal feelings or their personal things that have happened when we really need data. And I think the ability to increase our data and our knowledge. I mean, it's just, look what happens in medicine. This is how you treat, this disease back in the 1600s. And we're like, oh my gosh, those people were crazy for doing that. But really, that's what they thought. The data they had told them that was the right way to do it. And we're going to continue to do that in the medical industry for the rest of our existence on this planet, because we're going to realize we were completely treating something incorrectly or not doing that as we get more data. And I think it's important that however this is done, there needs to be a way to capture more data and understand what the actual effects are going to be. And as that data compiles, just like it did with climate change, just like it did with other things throughout history, people's minds have to be changed because data doesn't lie. So however we do this, I just really think it's important that data is still a key component of data collection, preservation, and accessibility is still a key component to this.
I want to jump in and just say I dropped in the chat when CDPHE was developing its equity framework. I think like 50 or 60 orgs came together to submit our own responses to how we thought it could be improved. And so I put the press release and our recommendations, the link to the folder there for people to take a look at. So that was some of the front work we did before 1266 was passed.
And I think one thing, and I haven't had a lot of experience with NEPA, it's been peripheral in terms of my involvement with that, but I have had a lot of policy conversations in this space as the federal government and states are looking at this. And I think one thing that's also important to make sure is incorporated into an equity analysis is, in addition to how you mitigate or eliminate impacts, is what potential benefit is there as well, and incorporate benefit. And I know, at least, we've had conversations with labor and others in terms of what does that look like from a workforce development standpoint, from other types of economic standpoints, and not the economics of the project itself, but the potential economic benefits to the community as a whole. So I would just want to be cognizant that as part of an equity analysis, that benefit is, at least the question is asked, is there a benefit as part of this, and be included in the equity analysis.
Yeah, I just want to completely echo that comment. I think, with regards to climate policy in particular, obviously avoiding future harms from policy is extremely important. However, I think there's often also a question of missed opportunities too. So for example, missed opportunities to redress historical environmental harms or create environmental improvements as a result of climate policy. And that is a key issue that needs to be addressed. It's not only mitigating any harms from any environmental policy that's put forward, but also ensuring that the benefits from policy flow to disproportionately impacted communities.
Yeah, Tyson.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think, as you look at things like there is a correlation. I don't think it is possible to completely take out the economic benefits or harm that something can do to a community, especially when you look, and I apologize, I don't mean to offend anyone who may be from California or love the state of California greatly, but they have continually been on the forefront of renewable energy and clean air and water, but they're also at the forefront of income disparity and massive issues from a homeless standpoint, and their disproportionately impacted communities are much larger than some of the ones that we have here in Colorado. And I want to make sure that we have a history, especially as Americans, we always do the righteous thing, and we always do what's right for everybody, and the greater good is what we always say. But a lot of time that has massive effects against people who didn't have a chance to say that. So, what I don't want to see, and what really worries me about the way we do things is we stick to one particular thing, and we do everything we can to get to that one thing, and we forget about all the other impacts that has. And there is a health and safety aspect of economic impact if it's negative, and that needs to be understood, that if you're creating a worse situation for a disproportionately impacted community as a whole, there's an effect to that too. So we obviously want to keep health and safety at the top and the forefront, but we also must realize that there is a health and safety aspect of being able to put food on your table and be able to pay your bills and being able to have jobs. So that's a tough balance, and it's every single person you ask about that's going to have a different opinion of what that is. So again, I think it comes down to put the data out there. If you collect all the data, there's no questions to be asked.
I mean, to be clear, though, the reverse is true. It is incredibly expensive to have health problems. It is incredibly expensive to have asthma. So public health is, of course, an economic issue as well as, a quality of life issue.
If I could, I would just like to add to that putting food on your table also depends on good health, and that depends on good environmental factors. So
there can be a lot to be said on miseducation and also continuously learning and involving more cultural context, because environmental racism does get based even in data on our own projections of just certain prejudice or certain bias of how you've been educated or how you assume certain communities will be. And so you only look for certain things sometimes too, even in data. So being really mindful of maybe continually involving learning in this space too, sometimes of just the dynamics of how cultures change, how it is in urban spaces, all that does become a real impact on a lot of data too.
That's a really good point. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind too, is is how it works through all different industries and types and policies that are created. Where are they putting affordable housing up? Where are they creating opportunities for lower income families? Where are these things happening? Because they all have a direct effect. And if these environmental areas that are damaging to people's health are where we're putting people on purpose, which is something that still goes on. And even though we don't call it redlining, even though we don't call it this, we don't call it that, we're still putting people in these situations. So, again, I don't have all the answers, and I think this is a generational fix. It's not something that's going to be fixed while I'm here on this earth, because it's taken generations to get here. But there's definitely an aspect of understanding how it has an overall effect, and not focusing on, just policies of putting up something that has an environmental impact, but policies of putting people in harm's way of places that already exist.
Any other thoughts? This has been a really, really great conversation, and the level of participation and just dialogue that you all have created is really incredible. Any thoughts before we take a short break? All right, well, thank you all so much for having such a stimulating conversation. Joel, were you gonna say something?
No, I'm just taking a deep breath after taking notes on that great conversation. We got a lot of really great material written down. So, and I'm glad my fingers got a break.
Yeah, we have quite a few monitors up right now, and I can see Joel like furiously typing away. So everybody's ideas are being captured, and we'll, do like a comb through of all these comments, and have not only meeting minutes, but hopefully some structural components that will come out of here and inform our next meeting. That said, I do want to give folks a second to breathe. We just had a really great conversation, and I want folks to have a few minutes to decompress. So we will break for about 10 minutes. And so if folks could be back here by 3, that would be great. So we had a lot to discuss. Just so everybody knows, when we do get back, we'll be doing a quick review of some definitions, and then getting into some of those questions that we were already referencing about, who should an environmental equity analysis be required for in terms of types of agencies, and which agencies exactly, and kind of what should that entail. And when we're talking about proposed state action and what like agency itself in the bill language, when that is outlined, as Tricia mentioned, agency is the Air Quality Control Commission, but having an in-depth discussion about whether that definition should be expanded and who else it should involve. So this conversation is to be continued. This was really just a good way to kind of get the juices flowing, but we'll be discussing those questions, and then also talking about timeline and then electing co-chairs. So with that in mind, as we leave for the break, if you have anybody that you would like to nominate, please send those nominations directly to Natalie. You can either nominate someone else or self-nominate. If you would like for that nomination to be public, just drop it in the chat. If you want it to be private, send a direct message to Natalie. So with that, we will break, and I will see you back here in 10 minutes at 3 p.m. All right, welcome back, everyone. If task force members could click their cameras on just to indicate that they're back. I recognize that some of you may not be able to do that, which is fine, but for those who can, that would be great. Okay, so as we come back, I do want to start off by, we have a task force member that I did not pause to introduce himself. So Doug, other folks introduced themselves at the beginning of the meeting. I just want to give you the opportunity to do that as well as a task force member. And so we had started off this session by providing our name, pronouns, and then what affiliation we have. So, you know, you're coming from the PUC, so sharing a bit about that. And then if you would like to answer the icebreaker question that we had earlier this morning, which is what is something that is making you excited to be alive right now? So maybe we could start with your introduction.
Sure, I'm Doug Dean. I'm the director of the PUC. Boy, what makes me excited to be alive right now? Looking forward to retirement.
Nice.
Are you close, Doug? Are you close?
About a year, maybe a little less.
Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Great. So thanks everybody for promptly coming back. We'll jump right back into our agenda. We have a lot of topics to cover in our last hour together. So if you just bear with me, I will do a screen share in just a moment. All right. Yes, as Natalie mentioned, we are continuing to accept nominations in the chat. So if you think of anybody or somebody says something during the meeting where you're like, I really want this person to be my co-chair suddenly, feel free to drop that in the chat or as a direct message to Natalie. All right, so there are just a few definitions that I'd like to go over. We talked about this during the first task force meeting. And so this slide will likely look familiar to you. But as we keep mentioning disproportionately impacted community, I wanted to clarify what exactly that means. And so there is this three-part definition in the Environmental Justice Act that identifies communities based on three demographic factors. And those three demographic factors being more than 40% low-income households, more than 40% people of color households, and more than 40% housing cost burden households. These are the three demographic factors that go into the definition of what is considered a disproportionately impacted community. Secondly, the Act identifies communities with a history of environmental racism. And as a caveat, we did hire, we have an intern who is studying the history of environmental racism and is conducting some initial research on this important issue. And then finally, the Act also identifies communities with cumulative impacts from many sources that contribute to persistent environmental health disparities. And we're using Colorado EnviroScreen as a tool to identify those communities. We won't get into a lot more detail of this definition. There is an entirely different subcommittee dedicated to talking about the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. There will obviously be information exchange and sharing at the next task force meeting, since that subcommittee already met. But just for your information, this is the definition here. I just mentioned cumulative impacts, and so to share exactly what that means for us, this is communities where multiple factors such as socioeconomic stressors, disproportionate environmental burdens, and lack of public participation cumulatively contribute to a persistent public health issue and environmental disparities. So we're really talking about this combined incremental effect on human health and our environment. And this really poses a serious threat to communities and then to their surroundings. And while each one of these issues might be insignificant in themselves, they come together. There's a cumulative impact that they have. So for example, a low-income community near a polluting facility that has, the polluting facility has impacted the air quality, the water quality in that neighborhood, and as a result has led to negative health outcomes such as asthma. And those have not been brought into the conversation about how to avoid these issues, how to minimize these issues, or mitigate the environmental hazards at hand. So that would be an example of a cumulative impact. And one thing to note is that cumulative impacts can be cross-media. They may involve concurrent impacts to air, water, and soil, which also means they might be regulated by different agencies. So it's something to think about. Additionally, they may be synergistic. So they may have a total impact that is greater than the sum of their parts, right? And then lastly, this is not very well wordsmithed. I kind of typed this up prior to this meeting, but in putting words to what an equity analysis is, the process of analyzing how different actions taken at the state level and by different agencies can uplift and reduce environmental health disparities in communities disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and the effects of climate change, ultimately helping with climate or environmental mitigation and community resiliency. And so this is kind of how, based on the bill language and the conversations that we've been having, how we've defined it. But this definition is subject to change, but I just wanted to kind of put this in front of folks to have some sort of clarity. All right, so questions for the subcommittee to answer. I know that we've talked a lot about questions and there were a lot of answers and we had a lot of dialogue, but this is kind of the latter half of the questions that I was referring to earlier. And these questions might look familiar because this is from the content description we provided when you all signed up for the subcommittee. In that I provided a spreadsheet that kind of broke down what each subcommittee would be focusing on. So this is coming directly from that. And this is coming from the Environmental Justice Act bill language, that document that we reviewed at the beginning. This is being pulled out from there. So questions for the subcommittee to answer: should an environmental equity analysis be required for certain types of agency decisions? If so, what types of agency action by which agencies? Should cumulative impacts be included in the analysis? And then should avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating adverse impacts to disproportionately impacted communities be a part of that analysis? And what about specifically for permitting decisions? So these are all, really heavy questions. They require a lot of time to unpack. I'm not expecting us to talk about all of this in the next 50 minutes. This is really meant to be a guideline for the conversations that we will be having over the next few months. And, I welcome you all to kind of share some initial thoughts as we are presenting these questions to you. And I will kind of mute myself and see if there's folks that want to engage in a dialogue around this. But one thing I do want to just mention is that this, actually, I'll go to the next slide. And Kimberly, I see you have your hand up. So actually, I'll let you go ahead and share.
Yeah, and this is just kind of more of a general question. I know that the local government space was like set for Commissioner Moreno. He didn't accept that. Have we filled that? Because I think there is a very specific component of understanding from the local government perspective in this, because in a lot of these specific state agency actions, there is that local government in most cases is the one actually putting various developments or various projects in certain locations in certain areas and defining where those where those projects go. And so my bigger question is, and maybe it's set for the task force meeting on the 22nd, but I think the local government voice in some of these conversations on this analysis is important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Joel, did you want to share at all?
Sure, I can answer that, and it's a great question. We were obviously disappointed that Commissioner Moreno wasn't able to accept his appointment. He was appointed by one of the legislative appointed bodies, and have been sort of working with our legislative liaison over the past few months to just sort of remind I believe it's the Senate Minority Leader that there is still this vacancy that needs to be appointed, and that actually additionally Brent Nation, who some of you may remember from the city of Fort Morgan, who was actually filling the seats for one of the DI community members from 4th Congressional District, but did also work for our local government. He unfortunately did have to resign from the task force due to health reasons a few weeks ago. So we have been working with our legislative liaison to encourage the legislators to make those appointments. Haven't heard anything lately, and so we are sending sort of periodic reminders where we can, but we really do want to make sure that local government voice is heard on the task force. And there are a lot of local governments around the state, and only one local government sort of formal representative. So it's an important kind of voice to be heard, and we do hope that appointment will be made soon.
Thanks, Joel. Tyson.
Yeah, kind of along those lines as far as who is going to be taking the action. One of my big concerns, and this just comes from my experience in my industry, which is a lot different than other industries, is the lack of consistency between regulatory agencies or who's making decisions for certain things. Because again, they're for example, and I know Joel, you'll be very familiar with this, oil and gas setbacks that keep oil and gas wells from further from occupied buildings and homes. You can build a home a lot closer than where you can drill it. So there's no way of keeping any consistency in that area. That's just one small example, but it goes really any direction you want from any industry, pollutant source. Only certain agencies, and it's a loaded question because there's only certain agencies that do certain actions for certain things. Is there a way to create consistency there? And can that be something that is part of the recommendation? Is how do you create a consistent playing field so that the loophole of just building closer to a pollutant source is not there. You shouldn't be able to put a pollutant source next to somebody, and you shouldn't be able to build somebody next to a pollutant source. It has the same effect on the people who end up being there. So you can say that they have a choice to do that, but a lot of times they don't, and a lot of times they don't have good information on where they're buying or what they're doing next to somewhere. So I understand that that's a loaded question, but that could probably spur 3 hours of conversation. But I just wanted to add that point of how do we create consistency when there's so many different agency actions around.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tyson. And if folks have thoughts or want to respond to that, feel free. Again, we are taking a lot of notes, and so this can all be kind of considered and structured into a future conversation. Ian, I saw you just came off mute. Did you have something to share?
Well, I just want to agree a little bit with what Tyson is saying. I think that we've said for a long time for community to engage in these different processes is like playing 9 different sports, and there doesn't seem to be any common way. And I think that that's been something that's been brought forward, especially in the public engagement side of it. But I do think there's obviously procedural rules and things that go into that. As I read these questions, I bet you there are agency actions that I don't know what they even are. And I've been an engaged person for quite some time. And I know adjudicatory, I know rulemaking, I know charter change, I know legislative, right? But we probably want to start by saying what are the agencies that were listed, and then asking the agencies what actions do they take, and then asking them to produce whatever guiding documents help them make it in the first place. Because then we can see what holes are missing and what is equal about them, I mean, procedurally speaking, and what's missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that said, I do want to just share this next slide, because this is kind of getting to, I guess, more questions that as a subcommittee that we want to be asking, or things that we should be analyzing. And so, to be clear, in the bill language, proposed state action could include rulemaking, permitting, and enforcement actions taken by any of the many agencies that regulate the environment within CDPHE, within DNR, Department of Transportation, the Public Utilities Commission, and the Department of Agriculture. Also, just keeping in mind that each one of these agencies can be broken down a lot. So like CDPHE, we have the Air Pollution and Control Division, we have the Division of Environmental Health and Sustainability, Hazardous Materials and Waste Management, Water Quality Control Division. And so, we got to think about every single one of these things and what we really want the definition to mean as we're going into this equity analysis. One thing that is pretty cut and dry that's in the EJATF is agency is defined as the Air Quality Control Commission. And so, we here are kind of thinking about, okay, should these definitions be specified or changed to be more broad? And so those are other questions that we kind of pose here for the task force to think about. Again, I know that these are very broad strokes and conversations that could go on for hours and hours. But I do want to dedicate just a few minutes if anybody has like some initial like burning thoughts or even like broad ideas or specific ideas, really whatever, for people to share based on these two slides. And if it's helpful, I can copy paste the language that was in the previous slide as well into the chat. Arthur.
Before we get into the conversation, I kind of just have a clarifying. So proposed state action is any of these things with CDPHE, DNR, but the agency is the AQCC. Like, how do those two play together? Because isn't the AQCC a commission under CDPHE and not DNR, CDOT, PUC, or AG?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, Arthur. Maybe we kind of put the language in a confusing place in the slide. I apologize, but you are charged with addressing the definition of both proposed state action, which is sort of defined as the statute as sort of anything in the APA sections. I'm giving you the lawyer answer. I believe it's 103 through 105, so that covers rulemaking, permitting, and enforcement, essentially. As well as what should the definition of agency be, which
so these are examples.
Yeah, so we gave kind of examples of essentially, to Ian's point, all the agencies that have a seat on the task force, right? So CDPHE, DNR, CDOT, the PUC, Department of Agriculture, which is pretty much a comprehensive list of all the agencies that have some sort of environmental regulatory role in state government, as well as the Colorado Energy Office, which is also in the task force, but doesn't quite play that same regulatory role. And so I think sort of a likely question that you all need to answer is agency defined, right? And should it be defined to include some of these other agencies? Then also is proposed action, state action, right? And are these the right actions where an equity analysis is appropriate? And there could even be sort of sub-configurations. It's sort of up to you as you think about this. But do you want to recommend that when the Air Quality Control Commission conducts a rulemaking, it should do an equity analysis, but maybe when a DNR sub-agency, I'll just pick on DRMS, the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety, does a permitting process, it should do an equity analysis, right? So I think that kind of your charge as a task force is looking at this very broad universe that's sort of laid out in the statute and kind of figuring out what you think would make sense to recommend to each of these agencies, the legislatures, about when and where a legislative or an equity analysis would be appropriate. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, Gary.
So I mean, I would agree with Ian in the chat. It talked about organizational charts and an overall outline of kind of, where the agencies are housed, what they're charged with doing, and kind of that broad overview, I think would really help at least steer the conversation in a productive direction. So we know, kind of exactly what kind of tiger we have by the tail here.
I also agree with asking the agencies themselves to do a first pass of what proposed state actions might fall under this purview. I think that might be a more productive way of going about this than, like, we could sit here and brainstorm a number of state actions, but I think having it come from the agencies themselves, at least as a first pass, seems like a good idea. Makes sense and might be more efficient.
So to that end, I think those are great suggestions. As a CDPHE rep, who would probably be on the hook then for kind of providing that. Like, can you just dive maybe more specifically into that? Like, when you're saying like what kinds of actions fall under this purview, like what would you be looking for, from CDPHE to describe? Like, is it like what kinds of rules do we do, or like what would be helpful?
So I guess from my experience on the AQCC, I think, that's one agency that I feel, fairly comfortable with, right? But the AQCC would consider regulations like oil and gas emission reduction regs that we did in December, but the APCD also does air permitting for stationary sources, and so kind of the laundry list of items that the agency has effect on.
Yeah.
Whereas, like if you looked at the Public Utilities Commission, electrical resource planning, but also like the upcoming gas line rulemaking on the extension rulemaking. And so like, as you kind of go through, I'm with Ian, I've tried to be active and engage in a lot of the different forums for the membership, but I know that there's a bunch of other things out there too that I'm probably not terribly familiar with. And so like understanding what is the role of the COGCC when it comes to regulating oil and gas versus what does get housed at the Air Quality Control Commission. So as you engage in the various forums, they're really charged and for good reason on specific parts of various industries. And so I think having like a broad grasp of what is all out there makes this exercise at least a little bit easier.
Got it. I can start to see that, just kind of trying to give a picture of like, okay, at least within CDPHE, here are the boards and commissions that they have. Here's sort of the breadth of what they deal with for different types of roles, and then similarly for the permits, and similarly for enforcement actions or other types of actions. Thank you. That was helpful.
I would add, just the procedural guidance for these places as well, I think is an important part, because it helps us get in the mind of what the decision maker is thinking and what they have available to them. I hadn't thought as deep as we had just heard about like what type of rulemaking, but that rulemaking happens at the commission. Permitting happens with these people. These are the procedural things, and then it would apply. But I do think a more comprehensive list helps long-term with community and public engagement. And so if we can double up on what these tasks ultimately accomplish, I think it's really good. And then, the one that crossed my mind, especially when Arthur was talking a second ago, was where does planning fit into it? Because a lot of what CDOT does, for example, like I don't know if it's technically a rulemaking but they like approve project planning, like a 10-year plan and things. And that's not exactly a permit, because it's not granting it to happen, because the funding has to appear for the plan to be realized. But the conversations about like cumulative pollution into the planning is a different thing that's not listed out here as a state action, as an example.
And I think you're referencing that to me with CDOT. I think that's a great question. So in terms of my role coming on brand new, that's certainly things that I appreciate that comment. So I'd love to talk deeper about that and what that looks like. So trying to upstand this new branch, what does that look like? So for me, this is definitely helpful as I look at working with Rebecca's team, looking at our transit design team, looking at our project delivery. One of the questions I've had to our team is like, how do we go about identifying projects, right? Because as we identify projects, where are we putting our dollars to help our communities? And so that's a really big question. So I'm only like 40 days in, still have a lot to learn. So I ask that you guys give me some grace, but I've heard all of the comments here, many of which I absolutely agree with, and even question myself as someone who's within CDOT as we look at upstanding, our efforts to outreach and engage the community, and how we involve you all in terms of our decision-making process. So looking forward to meeting many of you in the community and having these one-on-ones. I don't know if that helps, but great question. And I will definitely bring that to the table with our leadership.
Any other questions or comments around some of these questions? And I dropped both of the text from these slides into the chat. And as I mentioned to Jamie, these will be available. I'll PDF these and put those in the subcommittee folders. But any questions or comments kind of regarding this, as opposed to kind of answering them, just thoughts that you have kind of swirling around? Or any sort of like clarifying factors for anybody? Okay. So with that, as I mentioned, this is really the bulk of what we're going to be talking about in this equity analysis subcommittee. And so I share these questions with you because this will be guiding our conversation, and we'll need to think about exactly how to address all these questions and how we want to structure the meetings moving forward. So with that said, here is a timeline that I filled in based on what I just presented and what we know we need to discuss and decide on in terms of recommendations. As a reminder, we hope to have some draft recommendations ready to go by June. But this timeline is entirely subject to change and is really up to you all at the end of the day. So if folks here have ideas and what we are thinking in terms of timeline, please share those ideas now. Again, I populated this information in here, based on what we had kind of coming into this meeting. We've had a really fruitful conversation since these slides were developed. So, I encourage folks here to kind of share any thoughts they have in terms of what this timeline looks for this group moving forward. And we can start really basic as talking about how often we want to meet. So kind of just general operating, do we want to meet monthly? Do we want to meet every 3 weeks and have it be more frequently? I think we've established pretty well that we have our work cut out for us. I mean, this is just sharing recommendations on an equity analysis. There's a lot of pre-work that's going to need to go into that. And so this group will have to meet pretty regularly, and we'll probably have to figure out exactly how we want to work together even outside of these meetings, whether we want to have, this shared Google Doc. As an FYI, and on that note, we have cleared with Emily, who's in this meeting, that we could have a shared Google Doc that we place on the Google Drive that essentially would be open to the public for viewing, but only editable by task force members. And then we can kind of figure out exactly how we want to incorporate public comment. But just mentioning that because that is another mode of operating outside of just these video meetings. So I want to just pause and kind of see what people think in terms of the timeline, and we can have this conversation as we have been having, pretty informally. And you know, I welcome any thoughts and input, and Joel will take notes. I can also get into editing mode on this presentation and live edit kind of a timeline if folks are interested in kind of doing a quick timeline work session for the next 10 minutes or so. So open to any suggestions. Trisha.
So I'm just looking at what you've got for the timeline and comparing that with the discussion we just had about how it would be really helpful to have the agencies kind of provide an overview first, maybe before getting into some of the discussion, and then also looking at thinking through the other slide that also had questions about avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts, which I don't kind of see in here. And then looking at like what you've got for March and April, I'm not sure I understand the difference. Those to me almost seem like they could potentially be collapsed, right? Because what agencies should do what, to me, I think we'd be talking about what they should do for rulemaking versus permits and things like that. So I guess swirling around in my head is like, should we try to meet in February for the agencies to sort of share org charts and procedural rules and kind of an overview of the breadth of the work that's in the agencies, or should we repurpose March for that and kind of collapse what you've got for March and April into April? And then I guess I don't know where it would fit, and maybe if we were to meet every 3 weeks instead of every month, it would probably create one more meeting, and maybe that would create some space for having discussion around like how to or like to what extent an equity analysis should also analyze or provide some recommendations about how impacts could be avoided, minimized, mitigated. And then I guess one last thing that I thought was really important from the discussion today was about not only like when should an equity analysis be done and what should be in it, but the point that others raised about like, and then how are agencies empowered to change their decision based on information that is equity analysis.
Sorry, Trisha, I lost you in like the very last thing you said. You kind of faded away for a second.
Sorry about that. I think what I was saying was there was a lot of really great discussion today about not just like when should an equity analysis be done. We need to discuss that obviously, and then what goes in, you know, what should be in it. And that to me, that's like, you know, the avoiding, minimizing, mitigating impacts, but then also how do we empower decision makers to then use information from an equity analysis in decision making.
Gary and then Doug.
So I do think that makes a lot of sense to kind of have the meetings a little more spread out at the very beginning, because we are going to need to kind of gather information and then also have the task members allowed to kind of digest that. And you know, Trisha's example I think is perfect. You know, we got to assemble kind of what agencies are charged with what and how that's affected. And so I do like the idea of being able to see the information on the Google Drive and also have the ability to kind of post, like, can we get additional clarification on information? And that way, when we do meet, we keep the meetings efficient and productive. And I do, you know, see us probably meeting more frequently as we progress down the timeline. One, because, you know, the work kind of assignment responsibilities to fulfill. But, you know, as we get further down the process, we'll have more and more information to form, you know, how we want to kind of carry out our responsibilities.
Doug, sure.
Hi, sorry, it took me a second there to unmute. Just want to point out when we're talking about this, the timeline is a bit compressed here. The PUC was required in Senate Bill 272 to open up rulemakings on equity and disproportionately impacted communities and historical inequities and such. Right now we have starting a miscellaneous docket, but the actual rulemaking to implement this That's all governed by the APA, and that's going to take some time, and most likely won't even be started till late this year.
Yeah, and just to provide some clarity, this is a compressed timeline. We will be working on this through the summer and the fall, and of course our deadline is November 14th. So just keeping that in mind is that this compressed timeline is based on when we would present some draft recommendations. But thank you for sharing that, Doug. Those are all important considerations. Any other thoughts on timeline and kind of how we structure? There was a lot that was said, and I mentioned live editing this, which I don't think I can take everybody's comments and do that right now. So I will probably just share out kind of a proposed timeline and a future email. But while we're here, any thoughts on where we want to take this timeline and kind of content that we want to go over? Yeah, Ian.
Well, I think that we should, in addition to this internal timeline, we should probably be thinking about if there's any natural places we would like to conduct further engagement outside of these hours. And if so, we can make those recommendations to the community engagement, and they could maybe help us work on what that might look like. Because I do think it's important before we submit, or all along it, there needs to be opportunities for the public to engage that are beyond just watching these videos or making it at 4 o'clock on a weekday.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we can actually get into discussing that in just a moment. Any other folks specific to the timeline? Also, I did want to address the issue of how often we want to meet. I know that there might be kind of variability in frequency. It sounded like there were some folks that said that they maybe would want to meet a little bit less frequently and kind of rely on the documents in the Google Drive to kind of get settled and understanding the information and then kind of meeting regarding that. Do we want to, the reason I had kind of this timeline starting in March is because this is the last day of January. Our next full task force meeting is happening in 3 weeks. And so I wasn't sure how realistic it would be for folks to fit in another meeting next month. But, in terms of frequency and even length of the meeting, we can kind of discuss that in the next couple of minutes. Any thoughts there or strong opinions?
No, I guess I would just say what you've laid out seems like it's a good place to start, and then we can kind of continue to check in as we're moving forward of, is it enough time? Is it the right cadence? And adjust if we can and need to.
So do folks feel like a monthly meeting is sufficient, or do we want to meet a little bit more frequently than that, like every 3 weeks? Arthur?
I agree with Gary that I think less at the beginning and then backload the meetings, because there's going to be a lot of processing, and I don't need to repeat this point, but I agree with how he sequenced our meetings, give us more time up
front. Okay. Folks that want to give a thumbs up to agree with that, or people that want to come off mute that have a different thought or opinion?
Do the agency representatives think that a month is enough time for you to get that information? I just want to, not set you on an unreal expectation either.
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll have to probably kind of talk about that amongst our staff between Joel, Natalie, Rosario, and I to see kind of what that looks like, because we will be having another subcommittee meeting and then the task force meeting in the next 3 weeks. So I will get back to you on kind of what I think a realistic timeline would be on our end as well. Yeah, I don't have a firm answer for you yet until we kind of dive deep into what we want to share with you in terms of content.
And Lubna, as you all are thinking about that, I mean, think about whether we can have a conversation amongst the other state agency reps that are either part of this subcommittee or the task force as a whole, to what extent can we help support that work and do some of that, right, as opposed to falling on your shoulders. And, I know, Ian, if I were on point to kind of provide you an overview of CDPHE, 1 month would be fine. I could do that, but I don't want to speak for the other agencies, and I wouldn't be able to do it on behalf of like CDOT or DNR. So I think that would take a little bit more work unless those folks, would feel comfortable and could weigh in on the timeline.
From my perspective, the month should be fine.
All right, any other last minute thoughts? I know that we're kind of zooming through here, but I do want to get to electing our co-chairs. So any last thoughts before we move on to that?
I just had one thought, and I think this came up in the definition subcommittee as well. I think a lot of this is really going to tie in. I'm assuming that we're going to utilize the overall task force meetings to kind of discuss that, or if we aren't yet, I would definitely want to put that as part of the agenda, is the cross pollination of these subcommittees, because community engagement is going to have a massive effect on what we recommend for things going down the road, which is also going to be directly affected by the definitions that are put into place. It just, there's so much in my head anyways going around about how do we tie all these together, because I think it really is going to drive a lot of the decisions made in there. So if we haven't already, I just recommend we put some time in there for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be a huge chunk of what our overall task force meeting is going to be, is kind of a share out of what was discussed at each of the subcommittee meetings, and then an opportunity for task force members that are not on those subcommittees to kind of share and reflect. And that way, people are involved with every aspect of this. So we are definitely building that in.
I just have a process question. So if this goes back to the sunshine laws, so if the members of this meeting get together to talk about gathering that has to be publicly notified, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Though we as the EJ unit staff, and Emily can weigh in here, we can sort of individually coordinate with sort of each task force member. So for example, Lubna and I can work on talking to Jordan and Marcia and Megan, like kind of each of the agency reps about here's the information we need for the agency that is okay to do individually without kind of doing a group meeting.
Well, I hope they get together, because I think the best conversation is going to come from the people who do the work. And I just wanted to ask a clarifying question, as it's the first time we've encountered it, and we're going to be encountering subcommittee work probably.
Yeah. Okay, so we only have about 15 minutes left, and so we are going to rush into our co-chair elections. Just as a FYI, we have suggested a co-chair model for our entire task force, which we discussed at the last meeting and will officially vote on, because we have amended the bylaws since we last met. I also want to mention that all of the other subcommittees, so the one that is on community engagement, definition of disproportionately impacted community, and data and health disparities, will all have a chair model, not a co-chair model. That's because those subcommittees are much smaller. This is the largest subcommittee, and so we thought it would be helpful to have 2 co-chairs, and we can go ahead and kind of begin discussing those nominations and holding a vote shortly. So Natalie and Joel, I could use your help here. It looks like we have 2 nominations so far. Is that right?
So there are 3.
3, okay. Yes, so we have a nomination for Renee, for Jamie, and for Beatriz. And then I just want to take a moment for each of you to pause and see if you would like to accept the nomination first and foremost. If you do accept the nomination, then we can kind of go through a round of each of you maybe just taking a moment to share why you feel that you would be good for the role as co-chair of this subcommittee. And then we can kind of go into a vote. So with that said, Renee, do you accept your nomination as co-chair?
Yes.
Okay, and then Jaime, do you accept your nomination as co-chair?
I really do appreciate it, Beatriz. I think I'm going to respectfully decline, though.
Okay. And Beatriz, do you accept your nomination as co-chair?
I have a question. If you are a co-chair of subcommittee, you're not going to be a co-chair of the overall environmental justice task force, right? You would only be expected to do one.
So I don't think we have set parameters for that. At this time, I believe that if you are a co-chair of or a chair of a subcommittee, that you would be eligible to be a task force chair. We can discuss that as a task force. We can discuss if we want to build something into the bylaws that says that we cannot do that. But from where I stand right now, that is allowed. You can co-chair a subcommittee as well as an overall task force. Emily or Joel, if you have any countering thoughts, I welcome them.
I concur with that. I don't think there's anything that limits that. The bylaws don't speak to that.
So with that, I wanted to see, and Beatriz, I know that you might need some time to think about this, but would you like to accept your nomination as co-chair for this subcommittee?
I'll accept it. Thank you, whoever nominated me.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to throw in a last minute nomination or self-nomination before we start to get into just pitches and voting? I'll just give it a few seconds. Okay, I'm not seeing any other nominations. Okay, so with that said, we have two nominees. I don't know if we want to spend, I think we've had a really great conversation. I don't think we need to spend time doing a election pitch. So perhaps we can go ahead and vote if people are open to it. So the two co-chairs being Renee and Beatriz to co-chair the Equity Analysis Subcommittee. Just kind of by a head nod, are people okay with going into the voting process right now?
Lovna, this might be a dumb question, but is there a need to vote? We have two nominees for two positions and they've accepted. I'm not sure what we'd be voting on.
That's fine, as long as maybe we can just vote on accepting them as the co-chairs. Emily.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think, yeah, we should probably just memorialize it in a vote, but yeah. So I think someone needs to put forth a motion.
So I would make the motion that Beatriz and Renee be elected by acclamation to co-chair our subcommittee.
Second.
Okay, great. And do we need to do a overall count, Emily, now?
I think you can just have everyone say aye or no.
Okay, great.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Thank you, Beatriz.
Yeah, I think I caught everybody's eyes. I saw the little screens lighting up, so I'm pretty sure everybody contributed. So great, we have our two co-chairs, Renee and Beatriz. Thank you so much for stepping up to this position. I think you both will be excellent in these roles. Great, so very exciting. Glad that we are moving along with our leadership for each of these subcommittees. And I will be working with each of you moving forward to set the agenda and kind of think about next steps specifically for the subcommittee. All right, congratulations to both of you. In our last few minutes, I do just want to talk about next steps. So we did share some examples at the beginning of this meeting about existing equity analyses. And so I would suggest you all, if you want to kind of gain more exposure to what equity analyses look like and go through some of those examples, they were put in the chat before. I can also share those with you all in an email, or you can bookmark them however you would like to do it. But I encourage you all to review those examples before our next meeting. Reflecting on what types of agency decisions an environmental equity analysis should be required for. Again, no, this is a very loaded question and there's a lot of discussion to be had, but just kind of at the individual level, kind of thinking about that. If there are questions or comments that bubble up for you, please do email us, myself, or just EJ unit staff in general, and share your thoughts between meetings. We don't need to hold, you don't need to kind of keep all those thoughts to yourself until the next meeting. Your thoughts and comments will help shape future agendas and what we will be discussing. Next, I want to talk about, or especially at the next meeting, but we'll have a few minutes left at the end of this meeting for you all to share with us who else needs to be here, who else we need to hear from to answer these questions, and then thinking about who we need to bring into these conversations to formulate our recommendations. I'm sure folks have a lot of thoughts around this. And so in our last few minutes, if we want to talk about kind of general engagement, whether that's members of the public and how we might want to engage them in these subcommittee meetings as opposed to the general task force. As you all probably noticed, we did not have translation during this subcommittee meeting or interpretation. And we also do not have public comment during this. We did not have public comment during this meeting. So I would really encourage feedback around that and any thoughts that folks have. And as I mentioned, I will be working with Renee and Beatriz to set the agenda for the next meeting and kind of discuss timeline for the next few months. So these are all just general next steps. In the last few minutes that we have, I would really encourage any thoughts or comments around this third and fourth bullet point of like kind of who else to bring to the table and how we might want to engage the public. Any initial thoughts on who we need to hear from or have in these subcommittee meetings, or people that we would want to bring into the conversation that would, and these can be like just general members of the public, folks that you have worked with, community members. It could also be decision makers, folks who are in power that could really influence what we are discussing here today.
Yeah, I touched on it in terms of the local government representative, but I think aside from that, hearing from local governments, particularly as you start talking about state agency action and coordination with other agencies, there's a component of coordination with state agencies, but also coordination with local governments, because they're key to where the developments go, and understanding that perspective is really going to be helpful in the overall analysis.
Thanks, Kimberly. Any other thoughts on the public comment of this meeting or providing translation and interpretation? I do want to hear from task force members about whether we feel like we want to invite members of the public to provide public comments during these smaller subcommittee meetings, and if we feel that translation and interpretation services would be beneficial.
You know, I would be in favor of hearing from anybody that wants to make you know, comments to the subcommittee. I think the voices, you know, and opinions always help. And I would also be in favor if we do create a sign up for people to make comment to the subcommittee as we continue to do our work. Can we set it up to where they can elect interpretive services if needed? That way we can determine, you know, exactly what resources help based off who signs up to make comments.
Thanks, Gary. Any other opinions around this?
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
Sorry, Mira, go ahead.
I would definitely be open to having public comments in these subcommittee meetings. I think just as a reminder, a problem that we had last time was setting the public comment session start time a little bit early for a lot of people coming off of work. So I guess I would suggest if we do have public comments at the end of these sessions, that those occur later in the day, maybe starting at 5.
I think also from like an equity standpoint, I think we should have interpretation, and so different people that have different language preferences can access after or at a different time, and they can still get the information in the language that they prefer to hear it, regardless of the fact if somebody's here, making sure that we're transparent and accessible to more people.
Also, is there an ability to put a comment email address together or something in the fashion, because granted not everybody has email, but some people do, and people who want to watch this later and still submit comments, giving them the ability to do that. It goes into a folder so we can review them or go over them in the next meeting. You know, that would be good too, just for a timing sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have that set up, an ability for people to provide public comment via email. And we will be keeping track of all those public comments and putting them into a folder on the shared drive. All right. Okay, so I think that takes us to the end of our meeting. If anybody has any last minute thoughts or anything they want to share, please do come off mute right now. And I do just want to ground us in this conversation, again, thinking about the work that we are doing here in terms of the equity analysis, you know, our really end goal being uplifting our communities that are most disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards, and thinking about how we can develop and build community resiliency. And so I just want us kind of feeling that as we are walking away from this meeting. We have a lot of work to do, obviously, and this is going to be a long journey, but very compressed, in a compressed timeline, because our deadline is November 14th. I wish that we had many more months and years to discuss what we need to, but we do need to get to work, and I'm really excited about all of the thoughts and ideas and conversations that we had here. Thank you to Joel for taking extensive notes, and to Natalie for managing all of the Zoom logistics, and Emily just for being available to answer any questions that we have. Yeah, thanks for everybody's attention and participation. If you have any thoughts, follow-up questions, feedback between now and the main task force meeting, or when our next subcommittee meeting gets scheduled, please email me. I encourage over communication as opposed to under communication. So that covers everything. So we're at 4 o'clock, and that is a wrap. Thank you all so much. Bye, everyone.